All right, so today we have my old friend Vasant Dhar. He is a professor at the Stern School of Business and the Center for Data Science at NYU, where he teaches courses in data science, quantitative finance, fintech, and more. He was also the former editor-in-chief of the Big Data Journal, which is where we actually met. And I recently I'm a subscriber to the Financial Times, and I recently came across this opinion piece by Professor Aswath Damodaran of the NYU Stern School of Business, where he referred to a bot, and I'll kind of just quote from this article. This is an AI creation which had read everything that I had ever written, watched every webcast that I had ever posted, reviewed every valuation that I had made public. And I guess Vasant was behind this bot. So I said I got to get Vasant on the podcast to just drill down on this bot, but more broadly, get his thoughts on LLMs and generative AI in finance. So, with that long-winded intro, Vasant, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ben. Great to be on the show. And yeah, it's been a while since we've met. So good to be in touch again. So I should just give you a little bit of background as to why this thing came about in the first place, right? Because, I brought machine learning to Wall Street in 94, very early days. And I started using machine learning methods for systematic investing, which were not well received at the time. People were very suspicious of machine learning and any sort of method for knowledge discovery. People were concerned about overfitting. People hated neural networks, all that kind of stuff. So it had been a long time. And then in 2015, I approached Aswath, who is a colleague, and I was at the time, managing about give or take 400 million in the hedge fund. And I approached Aswath and said, I wonder if we can systematize you, like make a bot. I'd always wanted to consider making a bot of, Warren Buffett or Damodaran. And we talked at that time and felt that, it just wasn't ready. It wasn't going to work. It was too hard.
This is 2015.
2015, in fact, I checked my email. 2015 is when I first proposed the Damodaran bot.
This was even before Transformers.
Before Transformers, indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. So, and I guess at that time I was thinking more along like, could I build a predictive model for long-term investing based on Damodaran, right? So that's sort of how I was thinking in terms of sort of the machine learning paradigm, right? Because he was the only guy who had published anything significant, right, in the space, hundreds of valuations. So I did think about like, building a machine learning based model, but it just wasn't feasible, right? There wasn't enough data. There's too much judgment involved. So, we didn't.
So for those of us who don't know him, Vasant, so what is his reputation as in finance as for his valuations?
Yeah, so, Damodaran, I guess, has been doing valuation for a long time, right? That's his thing. He's referred to sort of the dean of valuation on Wall Street. Whenever people want to know what something should be worth, they get Damodaran on and talk to him. And his basic approach to valuation is fundamentals, cash flows. At the end of the day, he's calculating cash flows, discounting them and coming up with a number. Right? That's the beauty of his analysis. And
so completely quantitative. He doesn't look at how Warren Buffett sometimes factors in the management team.
Well, he does, right? So he used to be a pure numbers guy, and then I guess about 10-ish years ago, he realized that narratives were really important, and he wrote this book called Narratives and Numbers, which got my attention, where he basically said it's also about the story, right? The story matters, right? And so it's a question of putting the story and the numbers together, which I find fascinating, right? Because that's kind of, that seems like a very solid sort of basis to investing, right? Is there, what's the story? And do the numbers back up the story? And so I found his book really fascinating. And then, and his musings on markets, his blog gets, 20, 30, 40 million views. So he's obviously very widely followed and also has an influence on markets, right? So there's been this old ad, when E.F. Hutton talks, people listen, right? So when Damodaran talks, Wall Street listens. So he seemed like a good gold standard to shoot for when it came to actually, building an AI that could quote unquote think like him, right? So that's, so when GPT came out, I sort of, approached Damodaran again and I said, hey, like new set of tools, let's revisit this because, you've got more training data out there than anyone else. And he was quite enthusiastic. And so that's what kicked off the project. And, we have version 1.0 now
So
ready.
it sounds like this is like a collaborative effort. You got him to sign off and he helped you, gave you all the training data or resources you needed.
That's right. Yeah. So this is a project I'm doing jointly with one of my colleagues, Zhao Sidok. And, I went to Damodaran and he gave us basically everything that he's ever published, which is what he
So,
talks about in his blog. Yeah.
so what is, at this point, can you describe roughly what are the inputs to this bot and how does it work? So what's the user interface?
Well, the user interface is, you go to the bot and say, hey, what's BYD worth? Or what's NVIDIA worth? Right? Give me a number. Right? That's so just like the Damodaran would, right? He values a company. At the end of it, he produces a number. And then he produces like a range of numbers, right? So he comes up with an expected value, a number, and then he says, well, I could be wrong, and does sort of a sort of sensitivity analysis around what he calls value drivers, right? So, but let me back up a second because you asked like what's behind it, how does it work, right? So the interface is simply like you say, value this company for me, right? And that's exactly, the test we're doing is in fact on BYD. We're getting the bot to value BYD, and we recruited 7 of his students from his valuation class to do the same thing, and we want to see how well we do, right? And our goal is, hopefully we get a B grade from him. That's the goal. But, so the idea is, okay, value BYD for me or value NVIDIA for me. And you push a button and off it goes, gets all of the data, gets all of the numbers from the various sources, balance sheet, income statement, cash flow statements, like, comparables, estimates, just gets everything, all of the quantitative data.
So it basically mimics what he himself would do.
Exactly. Yeah. So
So
it
he
does that.
doesn't, it sounds like he doesn't pay attention to what other analysts are saying.
Well, I mean, he does pay attention to what, the chatter out there, right? So I've only described sort of half of the
Mhm.
process, which is the numbers, but then there's the other half, which is what's the story here? Like, what's going on here? How should I value NVIDIA? And in my blog that I published in response to Damodaran's blog, so my blog is called Damodaran Bot. I actually point out what's this bot really up against? Like, why is it so hard to get it to like think like Damodaran, right? So even though he says, "Oh, I'm at risk of being displaced," and Vasant is building this bot, how do I stay ahead of it? It's very far from where he is, and I point out why it's such a challenge, right? And if we take NVIDIA, for example, where he published a valuation last summer when it was trading at $430 a share and change, he did this analysis of it, and his conclusion was that it was a real stretch to evaluate at that number. And so he said he was selling half of his position, which he did. And I remember communicating with him at the time saying, it feels a little early to be selling. There's a huge momentum behind it. And he said, well, that's what happens with value investing is I tend to sell my big winners way too early, but then I'm spared the anguish when the bubble bursts. Right? So, here we are with NVIDIA, a year from now, and it's 3 times what it was then. So will the bubble burst? I don't know. It remains to be seen. But what's more relevant is how he goes about valuing a company, right? And as I point out in my newsletter, he asks the right questions, right? And they seem so obvious in retrospect, uh, once you've sort of read his reports, you say, oh, yeah, this is obvious, but would you have asked them? And the answer is, I don't know. I don't think so, right? So with NVIDIA, he starts with a very broad question, which is AI a revolutionary or an incremental technology, right? Which is a great question. And he said he'd consider it to be incremental, but with ChatGPT, he changed his mind because he can see that everyone can relate to it. And it affects everyone, it'll affect every industry. So he says, well, that's a revolutionary technology. And that sort of frames the analysis because it gives you a sense of how you should look at the market, and it dictates sort of what sort of estimate of market size you come up with.
So
And then he
Vasant,
goes on. Sorry.
Vasant, the questions that he asked about NVIDIA, does it start from a template of questions, or each company he has different questions?
That's the thing. They're different, right? So he has
Oh,
another analysis where he clubs Walgreens, Starbucks, and Intel in the same analysis, right? And you say, like, what? Like, wait a minute, like, what's common about these companies? And the answer is, well, they're all aging companies, right? And they are, sort of in a sense, refusing to age gracefully, right? So he sort of draws on this life cycle metaphor of companies to do that analysis, right? So every analysis that he does seems to be sort of anchored by a unique set of questions, but it's got to be finite, right? And that's one of the things that we're working towards is, trying to identify these high level questions that he uses to frame his analysis, right? I mean, to give you another example, and then I'll shut up. He talks about Zomato, which is a food delivery company in India, right? How do you value Zomato? And he says, just throw away everything the company says because it's obviously biased, right? And then so the way he values that is by sort of analyzing the eating habits of Indians, right? How often do they eat out? And he compares them to a market like China, which is more mature, but you've had food delivery companies, right? So there his framing is all around China, right? Because that's a well understood market. Companies have gone in there, they have valuations. And so he anchors his analysis in that way, right? And this sort of reminds me of like Phil Tedlock's work, right? Of these super forecasters, right? But they just have sort of this, what he calls they commit unnatural cognitive acts, where they just ask the right questions and keep asking questions, right? They're never really satisfied that they've got the answer. They keep asking questions and keep revising estimates. And Damodaran's like that, right? He's often wrong. He admits he's wrong, and he comes back and does it again, right? He's valued Tesla 3 times and says, I got it wrong the first time. I got it wrong the second time. Maybe I'll get it right this time. Um, so that's what we're really trying to do is, get a machine to think like him.
Do you have a unique data set in the following sense? Like you have a historical set of his valuations and the questions he asked to arrive at those valuations, something like that?
Yes. So we do. And as you can imagine, we sort of tried that approach of giving the LLM all of his blogs and saying, okay, ingest these, learn from them, and now value this company. It doesn't work, right? It just gives you mush in return. You have no idea how it's digested his writings, how it's, what it's really learned from them. So that was highly
Or you
unsatisfactory.
didn't, it's not like you had, okay, here's a blog from 2016 where he valued Intel, and here was Intel's income or P&L at the
Mhm.
same time, at
Yeah.
that period, which led to the blog post or whatever.
Right, right. Yeah, that doesn't work, right?
Okay.
You can't like just say, all right, use this as training data and now use this to predict something, you
Or
know.
just kind of understand what questions is he asking.
Well, but yeah, so that's actually interesting, right? So that's what we're trying to do now is instead of using all of his blogs to um, try and predict things directly, the question we're really asking is what are these meta level questions or approaches that he uses? Um, and we're having a little more success with that, right? The LLM is able to do a better job of this sort of meta level analysis of, how he thinks. And so that's sort of the way in which we're using his training data, is not to like build a predictive model, but to actually try and get at this sort of meta level analysis that he does, right? Can we actually unearth these framing questions, and is there a finite set of them? And then of course the question is like, how do you know which is the most appropriate one for a particular situation?
So as you described earlier, right? So part of the way the system works is you say, I'm interested in BYD. First thing the system does is it goes out and gathers everything that it can about BYD. And then somehow you have his brain or an AI that replicates his thinking and applies it to the data you gathered. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So it goes and gets data on BYD, but also on the uh, um, autonomous driving industry as a whole, the battery industry, right? So it goes off and does all that stuff. And in fact, it produced a report.
So do you
And
have to tell it,
I, yeah,
Vasant?
so I'm looking at a BYD report that it actually produced, and it's got a cute title. It's called BYD: Navigating Valuation in a Disruptive Market. I have no idea how it came up with that title, but
But
that's the title it
do you
came
have
up.
to tell it, Vasant, that okay, so I'm interested in BYD. It'll gather the data about BYD, but somehow it knows that hey, you should look at batteries too.
Yeah, exactly. It does, right? You should look at electric vehicles. You should look at batteries. Um, you should look at where, and it knows that BYD has.
What about regulations and subsidies and
It does know about regulation as well, right? So it is aware. Uh,
subsidies is a big thing, right? So tax breaks and tax
it,
rebates. Yeah,
it is, and it does seem to have sort of general knowledge about that as well, right? It is aware of subsidies. It's aware of regulation, and how regulation is different in different countries. So and of course we didn't have to tell it that, right?
so there's no fine tuning. You didn't have to fine tune the model. So you're just using a public model, an API for a public model.
Well, so this is work in progress, by the way, right?
Yeah.
So I shouldn't say, this is what we're doing and this
Yeah,
is
yeah.
the right way to do it, right? So
Or just
I'm just
generally give us a
I'm
big picture of
yeah. I mean, I'm just telling you how we've been groping our
yeah,
way
yeah,
forward, right? Which
yeah.
is start with the obvious thing. Well, that doesn't work. So, how do we get this thing to work better? Well, we need to get it to plan a little bit better, right? We know that generative AI sort of tends to be poor at planning. It just sort of blurts out stuff, from left to right, um, and it doesn't plan. So we know that it doesn't do that. So we sort of try and take pains to get it to quote unquote think before it writes, right? Do a little bit of planning, right? And we've sort of extracted some of that from our own sort of reading of how, Damodaran does valuation, right? So we've sort of given it a plan and have broken it down into sort of multiple agents, right? But
Interesting.
but that's us, right? We've decided, oh, let's have this kind of an agent, right? Let's have a valuation agent, and then let's have another kind of agent, right? So we've sort of cobbled together this, multi-agent architecture. And as I say this, it reminds me of sort of AI in the 70s, where people were also talking about agents and multi-agent architectures. So here we are back again. But that's sort of what we're doing, is breaking down the architecture into these multiple agents that can then go off and do their thing. And of course, one of the challenges is, how do you control this thing, right? And this is, again, brings me back to sort of the good old days of expert systems, right? Where we build these systems for reasoning, and then a major problem was like, how do you control its attention, right? That was the biggest problem in knowledge-based system, was controlling their attention. And it's interesting how we sort of went away from reasoning and attention to machine learning, and now we've come back to attention, with these generative models, where attention means something slightly different, but it's the same kind of idea, where where you're trying to sort of control the attention of this program. So, for example, to make things concrete, I said it goes off and gets the numbers, right? Well, okay, it goes off and gets the numbers, but then what does it do next? Well, it's not clear what it should do next. Should it go off and read the news first, right? Should it go off and get comparables first about what other analysts are saying? Like, what should it do? And the answer is, I don't know. Don't know yet.
But does order matter?
Well, I mean, order matters in the sense that the output will be different depending on the order.
Yeah. That's
true.
true.
So we know that the output will be different. And that, by the way, is also one of the vexing and frustrating things about this technology is that every time you run it, it produces a different report, and
it's probabilistic.
Well, yeah, I mean, it says different things, right? And one of the things that I'm sort of really fascinated by is, like in machine learning, I was, in finance, when I was building these machine learning models, I was concerned about model variance. That is, how stable is the model in response to changes in the training data, and I call that model variance. Here, we've got this sort of reasoning variance, right? Where you don't know what it's going to do. It'll do something reasonable, but there's variance, right? And so how do you really get your head around this sort of variance in its reasoning process, which is a little frustrating, I mean, the one thing we expected from machines was consistency. And here we are, where we have no idea what they're going to throw back at us.
So, and also, I think I would imagine that the system you're building is very sensitive to the actual prompts that you're formulating, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so we want to be very minimal. Yeah, we want to be like very minimal in the kind of prompts we give it. So I was talking earlier about like getting into plan, right? I mean, those are prompts we're giving it, right? We're telling it how to plan its valuation, based on what we think it's reasonable. But if we change the order of things, yeah, what is produced will differ. But hopefully, and this is one of the open questions right now, is how much does it differ? If there are minor variations, well, you should expect that. That's what you should expect of a human being, right? The human isn't going to produce the same report every time, given the same data, but it should be in the same ballpark, right? The reasoning should be similar. The conclusions should be similar. And to me, that's one of the big challenges now in the sort of new paradigm is how do you really get your head around the variance in the outcomes, in the outputs that it produces?
So are there kind of ideas from retrieval-augmented generation that map over here in the following sense, right? So once you kind of lock down your data sources, you can try to tell the system, look, only use these data sources. Don't make shit up. Don't hallucinate.
Mm-hmm.
I know you saw a lot of things during your training because you scoured the entire internet, but for the purposes of this valuation, here's what you should use.
Yeah, and that's sort of what we're trying to do. But, as you probably know and have experienced, you're sort of really fighting against a very deep-seated bias in the machine to want to please you, right? It's always trying to please you and give you something that it thinks you want and you'll be happy with. And so that's what it's sort of doing all the time, right? Behind the scenes. It has this sort of bias to want to please you. And other kinds of biases that we're not even aware of. But yeah, that's sort of, that you're in the right ballpark. That's exactly the kind of thing that we are trying to do is give it a minimal set of prompts and say, stick to this data, but it's really hard to not get it to go outside because it's just learned so much more. It just can't help itself.
Yeah. Actually, one thing that people don't realize is that these LLMs are also opinionated in the sense that they think the models think that, oh, I have saw this during my training, so I have an opinion. So even if you nudge it towards, hey, only use this information, it may still deviate. What about the notion of fine tuning a model just for your purpose? Is that something you guys?
Yeah, that's certainly on the table at the moment, right? Can we actually, whoops, sorry about that. I should have turned my phone ringer down. Yeah, that is certainly something on the cards, which is fine-tuning it to sort of quote unquote think more like him. But again, it's hard to sort of get it to it's hard to like control it that way. What I find is that, it picks up elements of, let's say, Damodaran style, right? So, for example, his analyses usually have a tension in them, right? He says, well, uh, here's, da da da. And he say, but on the other hand, here's what is going on behind the scenes, right? And so, um, when I was reading the report of BYD, I was reading it, and there's a sort of larger point I want to make here, which is that you have to be like really, really careful in reading the outputs of these things, to make sure that they make sense, because they can be little things. So, for example, it produced this BYD report, and it says, um, BYD has sort of a moat because they have vertical integration, let's say, relative to their competitors. Um, and then it goes off and, comes up with sort of some numbers based on that. And then it says, um, despite BYD's impressive growth trajectory, blah, 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 I believe it's undervalued. And I was like, wait a minute, like, what do you mean despite? It really should be more like, given its, impressive growth trajectory. But here it's sort of getting tripped up because it's learned how to talk like Damodaran a little bit, and sort of it wants to put this tension in, but it chooses the wrong word, right? So even though what it's saying makes sense, like, semantically it makes sense, like, when you think of it, it's like, wait a minute, like, it's just bolstering its point, not arguing against it. So it gets sort of tripped up in those kinds of things, which I think are happening, because we're trying to sort of fine tune it to talk like him. So the answer is, yeah, we're looking at it, but fine tuning has these other side effects, and sometimes they're, you don't really know what's happened under the hood.
Right. So I guess, Vasant, so there's two ways to kind of measure success here. One is you get the valuation that the Modron would have gotten most of the time. And then secondly, another measure of success is you can go to the system and ask it how it arrived at that valuation, much like you can approach him and he'll tell you, yeah, these are the key questions I had to answer. Um, so using those two kind of metrics, so how is the system doing in terms of the actual valuation prediction and also the explainability and kind of methodology description metric?
Wow, great question. So, so the goal is initially to get um, the machine to think like him, right? So, not to produce the same numbers that he does. And for that, he's a good evaluator, right? So he's going to read these reports and say, well, here's my thinking on, what I think is missing, what's good about it, right? So that's the first order of business. So that's where we are at right now is, can we actually get this thing to produce reports, have him value it, and give us a grade, right? So we are just about to give him something to read, and where we can get a grade. At the same time, I've actually started using it to value companies. So I just picked a random sample out of the S&P 500, 50 companies at random, just to see how it was doing. And we've had 4 data points now, like every week. I'm running it on these companies to see how stable it is. Where are its valuations relative to what Aswath says? Is it in the right ball? Is it even in the same ballpark? And so far, it sort of, it seems to be making sense in the valuations that it's coming up with. Most of them have been sort of within plus or minus 50% off the market valuation at the moment, right? So sometimes they're like 50, 60% higher, sometimes they're 50, 60% lower, right? So most of the scatter is, plus or minus 50%. So
That doesn't sound that good, does it?
well, I'm actually encouraged. I would have expected,
Yeah.
several 100%, right?
Yeah.
But at least it's, within like plus or minus 50%. That's not bad. I suspect when you have human analysts do it, you might end up with sort of a similar kind of scatter.
Oh.
So just sort of intuitively, what it's doing seems to make sense. It it's got a long way to go, by the way, because it just is, based on the report I'm reading, it doesn't have his level of skill. That is, I would have expected, Damodaran's report to be somehow different from this. I mean, it's doing a good job, but, I think it's far from being able to frame the situation with the same kind of skill that he does.
So let's say you get 10 of these reports to him and he provides you feedback. How would you use that to improve the system?
I don't know yet. It really would depend on the feedback. So for example, is it just doing a poor job of framing? Is it doing a poor job of writing it up? So at the moment, we don't know um, how he's going to evaluate, right? So we've got our own sort of valuations where we can see that, inconsistencies or strange use of language and stuff like that. We can pick those up. But the broader questions of, was it framed properly? Did the bot consider the range of situations like, regulation, like, global trends, like political trends, all of that kind of stuff, right? Is it doing an adequate job of those kinds of things, which we're not actually giving it, right? It's getting that from sort of its general sort of knowledge base. So not sure that answered your
And this
question.
is Vasant, just to kind of clarify. So these valuations are kind of like value investing. So the holding period for these trades, if they're used, are longer. So it's not reliant on super real-time news and information.
No. These are, yeah, in fact, which is why you'd expect the valuations from week to week to be relatively stable, which is what we're finding, right? They don't go wacko, right? So all of that makes makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you folks are building this, and then he wrote this column for the Financial Times. So surely other people on Wall Street where you're sitting have read this column. So what's the feedback and what are you hearing the actual firms are doing along these lines?
I haven't actually heard of anyone who's building this bot. I've talked about it now in a couple of forums and investment management conferences, and what people are doing is, on the sort of the more obvious things like, oh, can it write a report on the company like an analyst would? So I was at a conference last week where um, someone who runs an investment management company using fundamental analysis said we're unable to distinguish between reports produced by AI and analysts, right? So that's the kind of stuff people are looking at, right? Or a large fund looking at ways to summarize the market automatically, or produce boilerplate reports and things like that, right? That's sort of what I'm seeing more of. I haven't actually seen anyone take a crack at something like this, which is, let's make a bot that is both sort of wide, can talk about anything, but also deep in the sense of, having the kind of expertise of someone who's really good at what they do. So I haven't seen anyone doing that, but I would expect now that they've, seen that what we're doing, I would expect people to be wanting to do this and try it out themselves.
And this is one of the things about finance and Wall Street in general is that even if they're doing something, we won't know what they're doing, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'd like to, for example, I'd love to be able to use this bot for backtesting, right? Because one of the things I've always, I mean, I always backtest things because I want to know how a strategy behaves. And so the question is, can we actually backtest this, Damodaran bot, which is a fascinating question, right? Because the bot now has the foresight, right? It's got sort of knowledge that it wouldn't have had in 2015. So what would it even mean to like backtest something like that, right? It's a fascinating question as to whether this sort of knowledge leakage that we've had, that we know so much more, and now we're applying it to the past, does it actually produce a credible backtest? Interesting question. I don't know yet, but it's something I want to try out.
I guess what makes it difficult is you're relying on LLMs in the following sense, right? So even if you create a perfect backtesting data set, the LLM you're using is trained on up to current data. So
Indeed, indeed.
it may still kind of opine on
It
things
it
that it's
may
not supposed to, right? So
Yes, yes. It may opine, and plus, the biggest problem, of course, is you have no idea what the operators are doing behind the scenes, right? I mean, are you in fact dealing with the same animal that you were yesterday, or have they through RL, reinforcement learning feedback, somehow changed it? Are you now, dealing with a different animal than you were dealing with yesterday? So
so what's
that
the timeline, Vasant, for the next Warren Buffett to be a bot?
Well, yesterday. Well, so we've got version 1.0 ready.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we're already there, right? So we have something that quote unquote works, um, and now we need to evaluate like how well does it work, and is this something that actually can make its way into someone's investment management toolkit?
Yeah, and the nice thing about finance is that people will use it if it works, right? So it's not like it's an industry where bots are used all over the place, like in high frequency trading. Obviously, there it's all basically just it's not generative AI, so it's just statistical modeling and machine learning and data. But I don't think it's an industry that will oppose using something that as long as it can be shown to be working, right?
Exactly, yeah. As long as it works, as long as it makes money, people will use it. Of course, the evaluation will be a lot harder here, right? Because with those other algorithms, when I did high frequency trading, I could make out in a couple of days whether the algorithm had stopped working. With sort of other algorithms, it's harder. With something like this, the evaluation becomes more complicated, right? Because your holding periods are so much longer.
There's also, Vasant, there's also this interesting class of fund managers where uh, I guess what they're called, I guess they can be called like activist managers, right? So where they do,
Active, yeah.
yeah, they do activists, right? So
Oh,
they do
activist, okay.
Yeah, yeah, they do a valuation. They put the trade on, and then they go on CNBC and all over the place and opine. And if they're short, they trash the company all over the place, right? So,
Right, right.
I suppose you
Bill
can
Ackman, Herbal
yeah,
Life
yeah,
kind of thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. You can
Yeah.
build a bot that does the valuation, but you'll need to build like a bot personality that can go move the markets by its sheer presence, right?
Yeah, true that. Yeah, imagine having that bot, right? That the bot goes on the air and moves the market. Yeah. That'll be the day, right? The Damodaran bot goes on there and moves the market as opposed to Damodaran himself.
So at this point, you're not ready to say, okay, in 2 or 3 years, this will be common.
Um, I'm not ready to say that, but I will not be surprised at all if it's quite common in a few years.
Yeah, and what would you like? Now we have a lot of people working on LLMs and tools and things like that. What would you like to see from the people building the models or building tools?
That's a great question, because um, one of the things that I'm always trying to leverage is all of the knowledge that's being generated there by this tremendously energetic and productive AI community in terms of tools. So, for example, one of the things I've been looking at also is getting a machine to read price charts like vision stuff. And again, there's a huge amount of machinery out there where you can sort of leverage that. So I think anyone who's sort of interested in this, I'm so envious, uh, where things are relative to where they were 20, 30 years ago, where you had to sort of really build all these tools yourself. Right now, you can just start from such a high place where all of the, a lot of the sort of grunt work and the hard stuff's been done for you, and you've got these, tools. So I can't complain. I think the pace of innovation in LLMs and vision and stuff is just tremendous, right? And all of those can be leveraged for all kinds of domains. Like I'm using it in finance, but I've also started working on smell, on olfaction, where I'm using a lot of the machinery from computer vision to try and predict what a mouse is smelling, and ultimately to be able to diagnose diseases using smell. So and again, the whole sort of smell industry is going to make use of the machinery from machine vision. So these are tremendously exciting times, right? Where the toolkits, both from language but also vision and presumably other senses, are just becoming so powerful that they allow us to build these incredibly powerful systems. I mean, I couldn't imagine having built this Damodaran bot, even a few years ago. It was just like, no chance of that, right? Whereas now, there's so much power in the machinery out there that's like publicly available.
I guess I'll put in a word for what you mentioned earlier, which is tools to make it easy to backtest, not just for finance, but just in general. So that would mean maybe models that are trained up until a point of time in data, right? So you'd have like
Exactly.
versions of a model that's trained up to, 2015,
Yeah.
2016,
Hmm.
2017, which
Yeah.
means maybe get a copy of the Internet Archive up to that point, and then all books and all newspapers up to that point, and then you only use that to train the model. So it's almost like you have models of different vintage.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And with that, thank you, Vasant.
Thank you, Ben. Really enjoyed the conversation. Great to catch up with you again.